S is Sight for Dutch.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of your PA Dutch Minute. As some of you know, besides the YouTube channel, I also have a podcast called Doug's Front Porch, where I invite friends old and new on to talk about anything. It's really a conversation-based podcast. And recently I had the pleasure of interviewing an old friend, Dr. Bill Donner, for the podcast. And our conversation went in a direction that I was hoping it would go. And after getting done recording the interview, I said to myself, there is some really great content here that I'd also like to share with my YouTube subscribers and friends and fans because the conversation revolved around some things Pennsylvania Dutch oriented. Now, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Bill Donner is a doctor of anthropology, PhD. He is currently the chair of the anthropology and sociology department at Kutztown University, and he is also the Freiberger Chair for Pennsylvania German Studies at Kutztown University. Bill has been studying the Pennsylvania Dutch for many, many years. He's very active with the Kutztown Folk Festival, where he runs the seminar stage, which is really the place to get Pennsylvania Dutch education when you're at the Kutztown Folk Festival. He's also written the book Serious Nonsense, which takes a look at the history of Pennsylvania Dutch groundhog lodges. In our conversation, we get to talk about cultural identity. What does it mean to be Pennsylvania Dutch? Who gets to say they're Pennsylvania Dutch? Who gets to tell people that they're not Pennsylvania Dutch? Those are some things that I don't think we really get to talk about very often. And when I have someone that has spent their, 30 plus years or more of their career, but professional career studying anthropology, this is the person I want to ask these questions to. And luckily, Bill was more than willing to have that conversation with me. The conversation was so long that I'm going to break this down into two videos. So this is part one of our conversation. And then in the next episode, I'll come out with the second half of our conversation. So please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Bill Donner, professor of anthropology from Kutztown University. And you are currently the Freiberger Professor of Pennsylvania German Studies at Kutztown and also in the anthropology department. So I have some questions from your perspective about some of this. We've already touched a little bit about Pennsylvania Dutch things and Pennsylvania German things. And you know the work that I do and the audience does too. But I've had a couple interactions recently that have had me start to think about things maybe from a different perspective or at least think about them from a different perspective. And I wanted to run some of these ideas by you since given your background and you're a professional anthropologist. There was recently a heated conversation on Facebook. I was not involved, but I was watching this conversation unfold. And it was on one of these Pennsylvania Dutch group sites where people that are Pennsylvania Dutch were talking about all different things, whether it was food or memories from their grandparents, etc. But a pretty heated conversation got started and it continued, and a lot of different voices started jumping in. And essentially they were arguing over what does it mean to be Pennsylvania Dutch? Some people were making this argument that well, if you're not, if your ancestors weren't Pennsylvania Dutch, then you're not Pennsylvania Dutch. And then there were people that were saying, well, if you practice the old type of traditions, and if you're a Protestant Christian, then you can be Pennsylvania Dutch. And then there were all these people that were, or other people that were completely saying the exact opposite. Well, that's not necessarily the case, because just because I'm not a Christian or a Protestant, that shouldn't disqualify me from being Pennsylvania Dutch. So thinking of it from the anthropologist's perspective, let me ask you a couple questions about this conversation that I was really thinking about.
Yeah, I
What,
want to talk about that
yeah,
conversation.
what makes someone or some group Pennsylvania Dutch? We'll stick with that topic and that culture because it's the one that we know so well. So what, in your mind as an anthropologist, how do you answer that question? What makes someone or some group of people X? In this case, we're going to say Pennsylvania Dutch.
All right, now I'm going to have to give you a pointy-headed academic answer
That's
to that.
that's fine.
Everybody's right. For some people, and generally as anthropologists, we like to follow what people think. Some people will just be a matter of ancestry. For some people, it's going to be speaking the language, and for others, it's going to be self-identity. One of the things in contemporary American society, I don't want to offend your audiences, but we're very labile in terms of how people define their identity. We have white people claiming to be Black. We have senators claiming to be Native American. We have, biological males who are claiming to be females. And so I remember being at a conference actually at the center at Elizabethtown College, and somebody asked me that question. I said, well, if you call yourself Pennsylvania Dutch, I guess you're Pennsylvania Dutch. Now, that's the most, kind of flexible answer. And I know some people are going to be offended by that. But I think there are all sorts of different definitions of, identity today across the board in all sorts of different ways. And I think, we have to be open to the fact that different people are going to have different notions about what it means to be Pennsylvania Dutch. I'm glad you asked that question because I want you involved in this. We're thinking, Patrick and myself, Patrick Dunmoyer, who your audience should know, he's just a fantastic director at the Heritage Center. He really has made that a real center for Pennsylvania German studies here at Kutztown. I wouldn't be a Freiburger professor if it wasn't for him really getting that center going. Anyway, we're thinking about having a conference about the future of Pennsylvania Germans and the future of Pennsylvania German studies. And we want to have some leading scholars. We've talked to Josh Brown, I'm sure you know him, and Steve Nolt and Mark Loudon and Simon Bronner and some others. And we'd like to have a conference, but we'd also like to have, people like you who are involved. I don't know if you know Richard Miller down here, who's done a lot of things. But people are active amongst Pennsylvania Germans, don't necessarily have that foot after their name, but are very, active in what the culture is and what the culture is becoming. And see if I don't know, what will we define as the future of Pennsylvania Germans, and what will we define as the future of Pennsylvania German studies? And I'd just like to have a real talk about what that means. And maybe, they talk about people who study American ethnicity, talk about the fact, well, at least the European groups have all they've all assimilated. So the Irish, the Italians, the Greeks, they're all assimilated into a general American culture. The studies of German Americans, they assimilated. One of the interesting things is it's pretty clear the German Americans assimilated faster than the Pennsylvania Germans. Usually the German Americans followed the pattern of, 1 or 2 generations and assimilated. Pennsylvania Germans lasted, what, 9, 10 generations. Since World War II, the argument is, yeah, well, maybe they're following this pattern where they just see themselves as somehow white, Northern Europeans, something like that. So we'll have to, see how we fit into that thing. The argument is for ethnic groups, many of these ethnic groups, ethnicity has now become something celebratory, somehow symbolic and temporary, like you're Irish on St. Patrick's Day, or you're Italian on Columbus Day. You have a few symbolic things. You're Pennsylvania German at the Folk Festival. I'm not sure that's really the whole story here, but that's, one of the things we want to look at. What does it mean to be Pennsylvania German? And again, that question, who is? We're going to get a lot of different answers, but I think the answer is there may be a lot of different answers. One thing that I think is pretty clear is since World War II, there have been some pretty dramatic changes in terms of language loss, in terms of assimilation, in terms of, what's happening. Before World War II, there was a remarkable preservation of a language and, a distinctive culture. So, one thing we might want to look at is what's happened over the last 50, 70 years.
I guess that's a great follow-up, because the question I have next is, and again, going back to this conversation that was happening on Facebook, is a culture only defined by its past?
That's exactly,
yeah.
It's Pennsylvania German studies in the future just going to be about the past, or are we just going to be talking about, things people were doing 50 or 100 years ago? Somebody will find a new manuscript that Henry Harbaugh wrote, and that's, going to give us some insight into, something in the 19th century. I'm kind of open. You see, I think people like you are creating a kind of future, and you're ironically, you're using the internet, you're using, this high technology, digitalization, for a way to create a new way to be Pennsylvania German. Now,
yeah, it's great. You just said that, because it was another question I had was, and I guess you just answered it, but I'm going to ask it again anyway. How does a culture evolve? Is it organic? Is it that the group of people that are in this culture, they decide this is the direction we're going to go? Or is it, I'm sure it's much deeper than that, but in your mind as an anthropologist, how does a culture evolve?
Well, I guess, that's a good question. That's, 5 doctoral dissertations. Usually for an anthropologist, we look at context, and a lot of it has, historically been the environment. What is the environment like? And then what is the technology people develop to live in that environment? And we see as environments change slightly, pretty stable around the world until recently, at least, people develop technology, which then, changed in a sense who they were. And we think to some extent, the ideology, religion, that's all connected with technology. They reinforce, we have this idea of functionalism, different aspects of a culture seem to reinforce one another. I would say the major changes that you see globally over the last 50 or 100 years have been globalization, that there are these really powerful economic and cultural forces, part of them outgrowth of colonialism, part of them migration of Europeans to different parts of the world. And then part of it is the kind of super complex economic systems, capitalism, industrialization, the technology. Lord knows what, I don't know what's going to happen with AI and the internet and all the different things. One thing, see kind of people, they don't use their language much, but those, a lot of them migrate to a town, they're on Facebook. They're friends of mine on Facebook. I can follow what's going on. And I couldn't imagine that, when I was there 40 years ago. But there are these global processes that really seem to be affecting everybody. At the same time, you see some kind of backlash, people wanting to kind of reassert some kind of indigenous or special identity to kind of, I think, give them some anchoring in a rapidly changing culture. Which
I think that was one of the cruxes of that argument that was on Facebook, is because there were a lot of people that kept coming back to, well, how things were in the past is what defines us, and then there were people who were saying, but that's, okay, I get that, but that's shutting many generations out of the conversation that didn't live in the past that are living now. And I guess another kind of question I was thinking about that I wrote down was, what happens when, if we're looking at a culture, and we'll say the Pennsylvania Dutch or whoever, what happens when the present is so different from the past?
Let me just back up to one thing. One of my things is the Pennsylvania Germans were not the same. Their pasts were changing. And so if you start in 1730, somebody who was born then, by 1800, by the end of their life, they're living in a different culture, really a different society. And then somebody born in 1800, take them to 1870. They've gone through the Civil War. They've got the early parts of mechanization. Pennsylvania Germans are starting to write in a language that was never written. And then you go another 70 years. What does that take us to 1940? Again, you're getting somebody who's different. And so, it's not as if, Pennsylvania Germans were the same people from, 1700 to 1950. They were constantly changing. And then the question is, well, the changes that we've seen over the last 75 years seem especially dramatic and especially assimilating. And, maybe that's a change that changes everything. Yeah. We're no longer talking about change of a people who are changing in terms of their identity, but that's just, it's just leveled everything. That's one possibility. But one thing about change is, if you don't change, you end. So Latin's a dead language, except it's alive. It's Spanish. It's, I tell people it's Italian. It's all these other languages, and that's because it changed. And so, as you look at things, there's always this constant change. And people look back in the past and say, well, this isn't, the past, but the past itself was so different. So I don't.
Yeah, and I think also too many people have an image of what the past was, and the reality is most likely quite different from what they imagine it to have been.
Yeah, no, I think that's true too. I think the past was a lot rougher than people like to remember.
Another question I have for you as an anthropologist, I have a lot of friends in Europe, and I travel to Germany quite a bit. And when you talk to Germans about cultural identity and things like that, I mean, most Germans, for the most part, they're like, yeah, okay, I'm a German. Or, some will say, well, I'm a European. There are certain regions of Germany, actually the region where most of the Pennsylvania Dutch come from, the Pals, they're pretty proud to be Palatinate or Pfälzisch. But why do you think it is so important, or what it seems important to me, to a lot of Americans, to be able to say their cultural identity? I'm Italian American, or I'm Greek American, or I'm Pennsylvania Dutch. Why do you think is that unique to America, do you think? And if so, or if not, why or why not?
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure I have an answer to that. Part of it is that there are these processes where people don't want to be Italian American. They want to be American. They don't want to speak, that's how Italian got lost. That's probably how Pennsylvania Dutch got lost, in the mid-century. There were a lot of people saying, oh, that accent, that's something that's not good. And they want to be part of a national movement. At the same time, there's this sense, I want to be special. I want to be different. And that difference comes from ethnicities. And, the United States, the conservatives have a point here about what are the identity wars or something, that everything has to be, seen in terms of a particular identity. And this, speaks to Native Americans and outsiders are now, I think, appreciating non-Native Americans, appreciating Native American identity more than they did before. So we have these two forces going on, and on the one hand, people seem to have a unique special identity. On the other hand, there's all these pressures to assimilate into a larger one. But
I'd like to thank Dr. Donner for taking the time out of his busy schedule to sit down and talk with us about these concepts, these ideas that I don't think often enough we talk about, or we talk about often enough, I guess I should say. And remember, join us next time where we get to hear the second half of this conversation, and it's going to be more Pennsylvania Dutch themed stuff, but from a little bit different angle than what we just covered in this part of the conversation. So till then, dear friends, keep practicing your Pennsylvania Dutch, and Mach Scoot.
Moxie, and don't forget to like and subscribe. And schlock that notification bell.